posted on Twitter a couple of weeks ago to much response about how I control the floats in my stranded knitting. We all struggle with tension with stranded knitting. We don't want tense, tight strands behind because that tends to pull in and buckle our knitting. So we're always working on having a nice relaxed float on the back of our knitting so that it doesn't make that buckly effect. And people sometimes, I hear it said a lot, that the way to do that is to use a larger needle. And the problem with using a larger needle is then when you block out, you're going to be borrowing yarn only from the stitches at the edges of those blocks of color. So if I were to knit along using a larger needle, I would still have 3 big fat stitches in the middle of this 5-stitch block, and then I would be borrowing yarn, and really even then only from that one leg that goes directly into the float behind. So the key to controlling your floats is to make nice big floats as you're knitting, and to do that every time you change from one color to the next. So when I change from my bisque yarn to my rust color yarn, what I want to do is I commit to that first stitch in the rust colored yarn is, instead of making it sort of match the distance between here and there on my needle, I want to stretch out my stitches as I commit to that stitch so that I have lots of extra room for that float, and it doesn't pull my bisque color stitches tight. And what happens is then I do the same thing again when I change from my rust color to my bisque color. I've got this nice long 5-stitch float here. And I'm not trapping, I'm not talking about that today. So as I commit to that stitch, even if I make that stitch, what I will do is I will pull these guys an extra bit apart from each other so that I get this nice long float, even to the point where it feels like there's too much of a float back there. But what happens is, even if your floats feel wonky, say you feel like, oh, this is what they look like, they're going to be all sort of like dancy and all that, once you block your fabric, and even as you add several rounds or rows in your knitting, you'll find that they tend to do this. I call this lying down together. Sometimes I refer to them as fence rails. But they really have a tendency to just sort of behave as more of them come on board as you build up your fabric. So that is why I don't recommend larger needles. I just recommend larger floats.